Case 1. Maureen Argie. Maureen Argie was the person other families leaned on when they were falling apart. That was the shape of her whole life. As a dedicated social worker, she spent her days sitting with frightened people and their aging parents, carrying strangers through the worst days they'd ever face, and somehow making it feel survivable. The people who knew her described the kind of warmth that fills a room and never asks for anything back. She was the steady one, the one who showed up. And at home in Londonderry, New Hampshire, she was a mother of 2 young children who were the center of everything she did. By the spring of 2019, at 41, Maureen was doing the bravest thing she would ever do, quietly, carefully building a way out of her marriage so she could keep her children safe. Because the man she'd married had become someone she no longer recognized. Her husband, William Argie, a licensed physician assistant, a man trained and paid to preserve life, was being pulled under by a gambling addiction. The money gone, the accounts drained, the talk of bankruptcy, the marriage curdling into something cold. Her family had tried, a year earlier, to reach him. It hadn't worked. So Maureen made the decision so many women make, and so few are given credit for. She was going to leave. Divorce. Custody of the children. Sell the house. Start over at her mother's. A door out, and she was almost through it. On April 4th, 2019, Londonderry police went to the West Road home for a welfare check. They found Maureen dead inside. Her husband was gone. Investigators determined she had been strangled, and from the very first hours, they called the death suspicious. William Argie wasn't hard to find. He turned up the next day at Mohegan Sun in Connecticut, where he was taken into custody with self-inflicted injuries. And the story he carried all the way to trial was that Maureen's death had been self-inflicted, that he'd found her that way, in their home, with their 2 children asleep down the hall. But he hadn't called 911. He hadn't called her brother, or her mother, or anyone who loved her. Instead, prosecutors said, he took her car and her phone and drove to that casino, and her debit card was used along the way, after she was already gone. When a prosecutor pressed him on why he never called for help, his answer was 4 words the jury would not forget. "What would 911 do, sir?" But the case didn't rest on his coldness. It rested on a man named James Timbus, someone Argie used to gamble with, someone who'd listened to him say he hated his wife and wanted to be rid of her. Timbus testified that weeks before Maureen was found dead, Argie had asked him to help kill her and offered him a share of her life insurance to do it. Timbus said no, and when he heard Maureen had died, he walked into a police station. That policy was worth $400,000, and William Argie was its sole beneficiary. He stood to gain from her death. And, the state told the jury, he'd gone looking for someone to help him cause it. The jury didn't need long. In December 2021, they convicted William Argie of first-degree murder and of falsifying evidence. The judge sentenced him to life with no possibility of parole, and told him the evidence had been overwhelming, that his choices had devastated 2 small children who would feel that absence for the rest of their lives. He said he would appeal. In February 2025, the New Hampshire Supreme Court turned him away. The conviction stands. What follows now isn't part of the court's record. It's where we step back and offer what this channel sees in it. Here is our observation, not a legal finding. Maureen's story holds 2 warnings, sitting on opposite sides of the same man. The first is about what an addiction becomes when it's left to run. Gambling didn't only empty this family's accounts. It described a man who took the wreckage he'd made of his own life and turned it into blame, and then into something far worse. When a compulsion starts whispering that another person is what stands between you and the money, the freedom, the escape, The danger has stopped being financial. That's the moment it's no longer a wallet at stake, and the moment help matters most. The second warning belongs to everyone standing nearby. A man voiced the intent to kill his wife, more than once, and even asked for help. And it's such a human instinct to fold a line like that away, as bitterness, as venting, as talk. Maureen's case is a hard reminder of how rarely that's what it is. If someone tells you they mean to harm another person, silence is the one response that can cost a life. Repeating it, exactly as it was said, is sometimes the only thing that saves one. James Timbus couldn't speak up in time to change what happened to Maureen. But when it counted, he refused to stay quiet, and he took his place as a witness. Maureen Argie spent her life making sure that other people were never left alone with their worst day. That was her gift. Steady, generous, present, the kind of warmth that fills a room and never asks for anything back. A life like that is not measured in a life insurance policy. It's measured in the people she carried, the 2 children who were the whole of her heart, and everyone who was better for having known her. That is what was taken. That is what we choose to remember. We remember Maureen, and we leave the rest for you to weigh. Case 2, Emily Ferlazzo. Emily Ferlazzo walked into a room and lit it up before she'd said a word. She was 22. She sang, really sang, the kind of voice her family swears the whole world should have heard, and she laughed the sort of laugh people remember years later. She loved everything bright and sparkling. Summers at Hampton Beach with her best friend, her cat, and her dog, and the small, hopeful business of being young and just getting started. She'd earned her license as a nursing assistant and gone to work caring for people who couldn't care for themselves. She had a family who adored her. And a year into her marriage, she was still young enough that her whole life was supposed to be ahead of her. But inside that marriage, the light had been dimming for a while. Her husband, Joseph Ferlazzo, was a tattoo artist from Northfield, New Hampshire, and by the time investigators pieced their relationship together, they would document what police described plainly: a history of domestic violence and a young woman who had been seen with scratches and bruises. That was the quiet truth behind the couple photos. Emily was the one who'd been getting hurt. In October 2021, Emily and Joseph loaded the converted camper van they'd been living in and drove into Vermont to mark their first wedding anniversary. They met up with his sister near a ski resort in Bolton. It was supposed to be a celebration. Instead, at some point that night, inside that camper, the two of them argued, and Emily told her husband the truth she'd apparently reached. She didn't want to be with him anymore. A short time later, Joseph Ferlazzo retrieved a handgun and shot and killed her. Prosecutors would tell the jury, flatly, that Emily posed no threat to him at all. And then he did something that turned a killing into a 4-day deception. He concealed Emily's body. He told her family she'd walked off after a fight. He kept texting her phone, "Where are you, lovey? Talk to me, please." Building the picture of a worried husband searching for a missing wife. For days, that was the story the world was given. Emily Ferlazzo, missing. It wasn't true. Her family didn't believe it. They reported her missing and pushed, and Vermont State Police began to search. And 4 days after the killing, a trooper spotted Joseph at a convenience store in St. Albans. He was taken in, and he confessed, even drew detectives a diagram of the camper, marking where Emily's body could be found. That is where the search ended. At trial, Joseph Ferlazzo offered the jury a different account. He said he'd acted in self-defense, that he'd feared for his life during the argument. But he had told investigators no such thing in the days after his arrest. In the recorded confession, there was no mention of being afraid, no mention of self-defense, no mention of a threat. That claim surfaced for the first time when he took the witness stand. His defense called exactly one witness, himself. The jury of 7 women and 5 men had the option to convict on lesser charges. After deliberating and replaying his own testimony, they rejected the self-defense claim and in December 2024, convicted Joseph Ferlazzo of first-degree murder. In April 2025, Judge John Pocht sentenced him to 42.5 years to life and said what the evidence had made plain, that there was only one victim in this case, and her name was Emily. Ferlazzo is pursuing an appeal. The conviction stands. What comes next isn't in the trial transcript. It's the part where we set the record down and tell you what this channel takes from it. Consider this our reflection, not a ruling. Emily's story turns on a lie that almost every case like it depends on. She left. When a woman vanishes and the only account of how she left comes from the person she was last fighting with, that account deserves questions, because a missing person story can be manufactured, right down to the worried text sent to a phone its owner will never read again. Emily's family is the reason the truth surfaced at all. They knew her. They didn't accept the easy version, and their refusal to look away is what turned a missing wife back into a daughter who deserved answers. There's a second thread worth naming carefully. Self-defense is real. Some people genuinely kill to survive an abuser, and the courts exist in part to protect them. But a claim that appears for the first time on the witness stand, months after a confession that never mentioned fear, offered by the partner whose spouse had been the one with the bruises, is a very different thing, and a jury saw the difference. It's worth remembering that the person claiming to have feared for their life is not always the one who was ever in danger. Emily Ferlazzo had a voice that deserved to fill rooms and stages, and people who loved her made sure a courtroom heard it even after she was gone. Her best friend, Lauren Eckelberger, wrote and sang a song in her memory. Her mother shared a video of the daughter she raised, set to photographs from a life cut short. Supporters filled that room, some wearing shirts that read, "End Domestic Violence." And the judge who sentenced her killer said what everyone there already knew, that Emily's beautiful voice reached far past her singing into every corner of her life. She had dreamed of having children of her own one day. That is the Emily who remains. Bright, glittering, compassionate, impossible to miss. Not the silence that was forced on her, but the sound of her. We remember Emily, and we leave the rest for you to weigh. Case 3. Natalie Perriello. Natalie Perriello believed in kids the way most people only claim to. She was a teacher, first with 3rd and 4th graders, for 15 years, and then back at Lebanon High School, her own alma mater, the place she'd graduated from in 1987, teaching a new generation in the very halls where she'd once been a student. The thing everyone says about her is the same. She genuinely believed every child in front of her would go on to something good, and she taught like she meant it. At home in Grantham, New Hampshire, she was a mother of 4. She was 42 years old, and she spent the last stretch of her life trying, quietly and desperately, to get herself and her children to safety. Because her marriage had turned into something to survive. She and her husband, James Perriello, were separated. He'd moved out of the family home months earlier, and by the account laid out in court, he could not let her go. He had been secretly recording her. He was consumed by jealousy over the fact that the marriage was ending and that Natalie had moved on with her life. The court record frames what came next as a jealous rage. But we want to be precise about what Natalie was actually facing in those final months, because it is the whole point of her story. She was being threatened. Roughly 2 months before she died, Natalie gathered her children in the night and fled to the home of a close friend and colleague, a school principal, because James had threatened to kill them all. This wasn't a vague fear. It was a woman recognizing a lethal threat and physically running from it, children in tow. And she was not the only one who saw it coming. One of her own children, at just 12 years old, had already hidden the large kitchen knives in a toy box. A child quietly trying to disarm the danger she sensed in her own house, afraid of what her father might do to her mother. When a 12-year-old is hiding the knives, the warning could not be louder. On April 26, 2012, the couple went to marriage counseling. Afterward, James returned to the family home in Grantham, where all 4 of their children were, and that night he shot and killed Natalie. He called 911 himself, told the operator he had lost his cool and shot his wife, and was waiting outside when the first officer arrived. There would be no trial, and by design. In December 2013, James Perriello pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. Natalie's family supported that plea, and they said why. Their deepest concern was the children, who had already lived through enough, and who should not have to relive it on a witness stand. At the sentencing, 5 family members and a friend spoke. So did one of Natalie's own daughters, still a teenager, who stood in that courtroom and read a letter to her father. The judge imposed the maximum, 35 years to life. Under the terms of the plea, James Perriello will not even be eligible for parole until he is 75 years old. Here's where we step outside the court file and offer what this channel sees in Natalie's story. Take this as our reflection, not a legal conclusion. Most of these cases end with someone asking why she didn't leave, or why nobody saw it. Natalie's story is unbearable precisely because none of that applies. She saw it, she named it. She ran, with her children, to someone she trusted. Her 12-year-old saw it too, and hid the knives. The warning was recognized, and it was acted on, and it still wasn't enough. That's the hard truth worth sitting with. Recognizing danger is only half of safety. The other half is a world that responds fast enough and completely enough to make the leaving stick. Protective orders that hold, a community that closes ranks, distance that can't be undone in a single night. And there's a second thing worth saying plainly, because the record calls it a jealous rage. Jealousy is not a reason. Possessiveness is not a reason. The belief that a spouse belongs to you, that she isn't allowed to move on, to leave, to be free, is not a mitigating circumstance. It is very often the warning sign itself. When someone cannot tolerate being left and says so out loud, that is not heartbreak. That is danger announcing itself. Natalie Perriello spent her life convincing children they could become anything they wanted to be. Her students carry that with them still, grown now, some of them, and shaped by a teacher who never doubted them. That is the Natalie who remains, the believer, the encourager, the mother of 4 who fought to protect them to the very end. Not the fear she lived with, but the faith she gave away for free. We remember Natalie, and we leave the rest for you to weigh. Case 4. Amanda Jean, Amy Warf. Amy Warf once told her family that her biggest fear, starting out in life, was that people wouldn't take the time to really know her. They did. Everyone who met her seems to have kept her. She was warm and funny, a Northampton girl who'd grown into a woman people wanted around, the kind of friend who made you feel known. She worked as a financial counselor at Exeter Hospital, sitting with patients on some of their most stressful days and quietly helping them find a way through. And by early 2013, at 36, the center of her whole world was her baby son, not yet a year old. She had a new place. She had a boyfriend. She was starting over, taking the ordinary, hopeful steps of a woman building a life on her own terms, because she had already done the hard part. Amy had divorced Aaron Desjardins the year before, in February 2012, after 7 years of marriage. They shared that little boy, and by every public account, she believed the worst was behind her. They were working out custody, and she was moving forward. But what Amy did not know was that, to her ex-husband, the divorce had never ended anything. Prosecutors would later lay out a plot that reached all the way back to 2011, to the moment she left him. For roughly 2 years, while Amy was rebuilding her life, Aaron Desjardins was planning to end it. And he didn't plan alone. He drew his own sister and his new wife into it, and neither of them simply looked away. His sister drove down from Maine carrying a gun taken from their father's house to be used against Amy. His new wife would cover for him afterward, giving investigators a false alibi, not once, but twice. On the morning of March 7, 2013, Aaron Desjardins was waiting for Amy in the parking lot of the hospital where she worked. He forced her into her own car and made her drive to a concrete plant in Exeter that had sat abandoned for 2 decades. And before he killed her, according to the case laid out in court, he asked her 2 questions. He asked why she had left him, and he asked whether he was still the beneficiary on her life insurance policy. Amy fought him. She fought hard for her life. She did not survive. He then set a fire to try to erase what he had done, and it was that fire that brought Exeter firefighters to the plant early that morning, where they found her. At first, Aaron Desjardins told anyone who'd listen that he had nothing to do with it, that he had nothing to hide. He floated an insanity defense. But the evidence closed in, and in 2014 he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and to 2 counts of conspiracy. In August 2015, in Rockingham County Superior Court, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge called his actions selfish and depraved. His sister, Michelle Corson, and his current wife, Sarah Desjardins, were both convicted for their roles, the sister who supplied the weapon and the wife who lied to shield him. Amy's family opposed the plea deal that spared him a trial. Her mother stood in that courtroom and spoke of the daughter and the grandson and the family who had all been handed a life sentence of their own. Step back from the verdict with us for a moment. This is what we see, not what the court found. There's a comforting myth that the danger ends at the door, that once a woman is divorced, moved out, moved on, the risk goes with the marriage. Amy's case is the hard argument against it. She left in 2011. She was murdered in 2013. 2 years stood between her decision to be free and the morning he took her freedom, and he spent those 2 years planning. The most dangerous thing about a man who cannot accept being left is that his obsession keeps its own calendar. It does not expire when the divorce is final. Where there is a child in the middle, or money, or wounded pride, the risk can quietly persist, and sometimes deepen, long after everyone assumes the hard part is over. And listen to that final question he asked her. Not who is he, not will I see my son, but whether he was still owed her insurance. In his mind, Amy had stopped being a person and become a policy. That is the coldest edge of possessiveness. The moment a partner is reduced to an asset to be collected. Safety planning, for anyone helping someone leave, cannot end on the day the papers are signed. Sometimes that day is where the real vigilance has to begin. Amy Warf was afraid, once, that the world wouldn't take the time to know her. The truth is that everyone who did know her loved her completely, and when they laid her to rest, they carried her baby boy into the church in their arms. That is the Amy who remains. Warm, funny, deeply known, a young mother stepping into a brand new life. Not the morning that was stolen from her, but all the ordinary mornings she was building toward. We remember Amy, and we leave the rest for you to weigh. Case 5. Nathalia DaPaixao. Nathalia DaPaixao carried her own name through her marriage, her own name from her own family, and she carried her whole world in her 2 children. She was 35, a wife, a mother, part of a close Brazilian community in Concord, New Hampshire, the kind of woman whose friends describe her in the present tense even now, because that's how present she still is to them. When the worst happened, it was those friends who moved first. A whole community closing around her family within days, determined that her children would not be left to face what came next alone. That tells you something about who Nathalia was. People loved her enough to catch what was falling. But behind the front door, her marriage had been wearing thin for a long time. The record laid out later described a relationship where the arguments had grown more frequent and more bitter, and where money had become a constant fault line. And Nathalia had arrived at a decision that so many women in these stories reach. She wanted a divorce. She wanted out. It was a Sunday, July 28, 2019. The morning began with something almost aching in how ordinary it was. Her husband, Emerson Figueiredo, had come home late, the family had missed church, and the 2 of them argued about how to spend the rest of the day. A missed service, a disagreement about the beach. On the surface, nothing. But underneath that small Sunday quarrel sat everything that had been building. The money, the distance, and Nathalia saying, again, that she wanted to end the marriage. According to the account prosecutors gave the court, That was the moment Figueiredo's anger turned into something no one had seen from him before. He said, in effect, that she was not going to ruin his life, and then he made sure she never had the chance to try. What happened next did not stay hidden inside an apartment, the way this violence usually does. It spilled out into the open, into a parking lot, in the middle of a Sunday, in front of neighbors. People saw it. People called 911. Some of them tried to step in and help her. It was not enough. Nathalia was gravely wounded and taken to the hospital, where she died of her injuries. Figueiredo himself made a call, admitted what he had done, and was still there when officers arrived. There was no question of who was responsible, and in the end, no trial. In November 2020, Emerson Figueiredo pleaded guilty to knowing second-degree murder. At his sentencing in January 2021, prosecutors asked the court for 45 years to life. His defense asked for 25. The judge imposed the maximum, 45 years to life in state prison. The record ends here, and our reflection begins. What we notice, not what the court decided. It would be easy to look at that Sunday and see a killing that erupted out of nowhere, over nothing. A late morning, a missed church service, an argument about the beach. That reading is a trap. These killings almost never turn on the trigger. They turn on the trajectory. What actually mattered in Nathalia's marriage was never the beach. It was a curve that had been climbing for a long time, arguments growing more frequent, conflict hardening around money, and a woman moving toward the door. The spark on the final morning was almost beside the point. The danger was in the slope. So when you notice a relationship where the fights are coming more often and cutting deeper, where one person cannot tolerate the other's independence, watch the direction it's traveling, not the size of the latest argument. The trajectory is the warning. The trigger is only the day it happened to arrive. And there's one more thing Nathalia's story surfaces that most of these don't. This violence happened in public, in front of ordinary people who had to decide, in real time, what to do. Some called for help, some tried to intervene. That instinct, to not look away, to pick up the phone, to step towards someone in danger rather than past them, is not nothing. It is, very often, the only thing standing between a person and the worst moment of their life. Nathalia DaPaixao was a mother above all else. That was the center of her, the thing everyone who knew her names first. In a single day, her 2 children lost her, and lost the family they'd known. But they were not left to fall. Within a day of her death, the friends who loved Nathalia, her Brazilian community in Concord, had already come together, raising money to carry those children through the impossible weeks ahead, and to lay their mother to rest. They caught the kids the way Nathalia had spent her own life catching everyone around her. That is the Nathalia who remains, devoted, warm, surrounded by people who still speak of her like she's in the next room. Not the Sunday that took her, but the love she built that outlasted it. We remember Nathalia, and we leave the rest for you to weigh. Case 6. Joanna Maureen Colella. Joanna Colella spent her days doing one of the quietest, hardest jobs there is, caring for people who could no longer fully care for themselves. She was a licensed nursing assistant at an assisted living home, the person who showed up for the elderly on their most vulnerable days, with patience and a kind of steady gentleness that her family says came naturally to her. Away from work, she made jewelry with her hands. She had a soft spot for animals and a stubborn habit of finding the bright side of almost anything. Most of all, she was a mother, and her son was the center of her world. She was 43 years old, living in a condo in Dover, New Hampshire, with her husband Jeremy. And by every outward sign, in August of 2018, life was ordinary. That's part of what makes this case so unsettling. There was no public unraveling to point to. No documented history of threats aired in court. No motive the state ever put on the record. What we know is what happened, not why. That weekend, Jeremy's father, Francis Colella, known to everyone as Frank, was visiting from Georgia, staying with them at the condo. He was 69, and sometime between that Sunday afternoon and Monday morning, inside that home, Jeremy Colella strangled both his wife and his father. A neighbor would later recall hearing sounds that night and thinking little of it. He concealed their bodies in the home. And then, on August 20th, 2018, Jeremy Colella walked up to a Dover police officer and told him, plainly, that he had killed his wife and his father. That confession is how the world learned Joanna and Frank were gone. Officers went to the condo and found them. The medical examiner determined they had both died the same way. At first, Jeremy Colella pleaded not guilty. He was indicted on charges that included first-degree murder for his father's death and second-degree murder for Joanna's, and he sat in jail for nearly 3 years as the case moved forward. Then, in August 2021, it ended without a trial. Under a negotiated agreement, Jeremy Colella pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder and was sentenced to 35 years to life in the New Hampshire State Prison. Here the court record stops, and what we make of it begins. These are our thoughts on Joanna's story, not the court's judgment. Most of the cases we cover come with a trail of warning signs, and there's real value in naming them, because naming them can save a life. But we would be doing you a disservice if we pretended every case works that way. Joanna's doesn't. There is no tidy motive here, no escalating threat we can hold up and say, there, that was the moment to act. Sometimes the record simply doesn't give us a why, and when it doesn't, the honest thing is to admit it rather than invent one. That, in itself, is worth sitting with. Not all danger announces itself in advance. What Joanna's case does show us, with terrible clarity, is something else. When violence detonates inside a home, it rarely stays confined to the 2 people in the marriage. Frank Colella was not part of any conflict. He was a father who had come to visit his son, and he died in the same house on the same night. The danger in a household that turns lethal radiates outward, to parents, to relatives, to anyone under that roof, to guests who happen to be there. It is one of the most sobering truths in all of this. Recognizing that a home has become dangerous is never only about protecting one person. It can be about everyone inside it. Joanna Colella deserved decades more than she was given. She should have grown old the way the people she cared for did, surrounded by someone as gentle as she was. She should be making jewelry right now, finding the bright side of some ordinary Tuesday, watching her son grow into the man he's becoming. That is the Joanna worth holding on to. The caregiver, the optimist, the mother who loved fiercely and well. And Frank, too, the grandfather who simply came to see his son. They are not the silence that ended that August night. They are the lives that filled every night before it. We remember Joanna, and we leave the rest for you to weigh. Case 7. Kelly J. Robarge. Kelly Robarge was the kind of person who filled her days with everything she loved and everyone she loved. She was an orthodontic assistant, the friendly face at the office that put nervous kids at ease. Away from work, she was happiest outdoors, near the ocean, out on her motorcycle, chasing the open air. She had been married for more than 20 years and had 2 grown daughters who called her not just their mother but their best friend. And she had become a grandmother, a role she adored. On the last ordinary morning of her life, she had her 1-year-old grandson with her, the way a doting grandmother does. She was 42 years old, and after 2 decades of marriage, Kelly had decided it was time to start a new chapter on her own. That decision, and the day she acted on it, sit at the center of what happened to her. On June 27, 2013, Kelly drove to the courthouse and filed for divorce from her husband, James Robarge, ending more than 20 years of marriage. Her grandson was with her that day. After she filed the papers, she texted friends to tell them her husband was at her Charlestown home and that she was going to tell him about the divorce in person. Those texts are among the last anyone heard from her. Kelly disappeared from her home that same day. A neighbor would later report hearing a man and a woman fighting at the house. When she couldn't be found, a search began, and 10 days later, Kelly's body was discovered in a wooded area in the town of Unity, roughly 10 miles from her home. The condition in which she was found meant that a medical examiner could not determine exactly how she died. What investigators built, instead, was a case assembled piece by piece. Prosecutors presented evidence that Kelly's blood was found in the entryway of her home, on James Robarge's clothing and shoes, and in the trunk of his car. His disabled vehicle was found not far from where her body lay. a man in Unity, testified he'd seen Robarge wearing latex gloves, crouched beside that car the night Kelly vanished. Forensic experts said metal fragments on the road matched Robarge's shattered oil pan, and cell phone analysis, which the defense sharply disputed, placed him near the home that morning. James Robarge took the stand at his own 19-day trial and told the jury he did not kill his wife. The jury did not agree. In February 2015, they rejected a first-degree murder charge, but convicted him of reckless second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 30 years to life. He appealed his conviction to the New Hampshire Supreme Court, challenging some of the evidence used against him, and the court upheld the conviction. To this day, James Robarge maintains that he is innocent. Now we turn to what this channel makes of Kelly's story. And because this conviction remains contested, we offer what follows as our perspective, nothing more, and never as a verdict of our own. Set aside the dispute over this one case for a moment, and look at the shape of that final day, because the pattern it fits is one worth understanding no matter what. A woman decides to leave a long marriage. She takes the concrete, official step of filing, and then she plans to deliver that news, in person, to the man she's leaving. Across the research on these crimes, that sequence describes the single most dangerous window there is. It isn't the leaving in the abstract that carries the sharpest risk. It's the acute moment, the confrontation, the hours around the announcement, when a person who cannot bear to be left is told, directly, that it's happening. That's the flashpoint. So if there's something practical to carry from Kelly's story, it's this. The way that news is delivered matters enormously. The safest version of that moment is rarely alone, rarely in person, rarely behind a closed door with no one else near. Delivering it through a lawyer, in a public place, with others present, with a plan already in motion, is not cowardice. It is survival strategy for the most dangerous hour. Kelly Robarge should be on her motorcycle right now, somewhere near the water, her grandson growing up with her in it. She was a mother who doubled as a best friend, a grandmother in the fullness of that joy, a woman who loved the outdoors and the people in her life without reservation. That is who Kelly was, and who she remains to the family who lost her. Not the 10 days they spent searching, but the decades she spent loving them. We remember Kelly, and we leave the rest for you to weigh. Case 8. Joanne Francis. Joanne Francis spent her working life in the one chair where people tell you everything. She was a hairdresser, and she owned her own small shop in Hooksett, New Hampshire, the kind of place where a haircut is really only half of what people come for. The other half is being listened to, and Joanne was good at that, good enough to build a business on it. She carried her own family name her whole life, through marriage and everything after. Francis, the name she was born with. She loved summers at the campground, and more than anything, she loved being a grandmother. She had 3 daughters and 6 grandchildren, and at 60 years old, she had built exactly the kind of life a person hopes to grow old inside of. In October of 2008, Joanne was at the family's camper at the Friendly Beaver Campground in New Boston, New Hampshire, with her husband, Robert DuPont. And it was there, that October, that Joanne was stabbed and killed. Robert DuPont was charged with her murder. What makes Joanne's case different from the others in this episode is not how it began, but how it was fought in court, because Robert DuPont did not deny that Joanne died at his hands. He argued that it wasn't murder. He told the court he had acted in self-defense. By his account, the two had exchanged words, and as he turned to leave, Joanne grabbed him and cut his arm with a knife. A struggle followed, he said, as he tried to take the knife away from her, and she was killed somewhere in that struggle. He claimed he couldn't actually remember how she came to be wounded, only that it must have happened as they fought for the knife. Here is the part worth paying attention to. The trial court took that claim seriously. It found there was enough evidence to instruct the jury not only on self-defense, but also on lesser charges, on manslaughter, on negligent homicide, options that would have carried far less weight than murder. In other words, the jury was given every door. They were free to believe Robert DuPont acted to protect himself. They were free to decide this was a tragedy that fell short of murder. But when they weighed his account against the physical evidence, including the number and nature of Joanne's wounds, which were difficult to reconcile with a single brief struggle over a knife, They walked through none of those doors. In 2011, the jury convicted Robert DuPont of second-degree murder. He appealed, arguing the jury had been instructed improperly on self-defense. In 2013, the New Hampshire Supreme Court reviewed that argument, found no reversible error, and affirmed the conviction. It stands today. This closing thought belongs to us, not to the courtroom. We offer it as commentary, never as a finding of law. We want to be very clear about something, because it matters. Self-defense is real. Every year, people, and disproportionately women trapped with a violent partner, genuinely kill to survive, and the law exists in part to protect exactly those people. A self-defense claim is not a trick. It is a vital, legitimate protection, and it deserves to be heard seriously every single time. That is precisely why the process matters so much. A claim like that is not accepted or rejected on a gut feeling, or on who tells the more sympathetic story. The burden sits with the state to disprove it. A jury weighs the account against the physical evidence, the wounds, the scene, the credibility of the person telling it. Sometimes that process protects a survivor who did what she had to do to live. And sometimes, as a fully informed jury concluded here, the evidence simply doesn't support the claim. The reason this matters to you, as someone trying to understand these cases, is this. The words, "I feared for my life," can be the honest truth of a battered spouse, or they can be the final argument of the person who did the killing. They sound identical. It is only the evidence, tested in the open, that can tell the two apart. That is what a courtroom is for. Joanne Francis deserved to grow old in that shop, listening, laughing, sending people back out into the world feeling a little better than when they came in. She deserved decades more of campground summers and grandchildren climbing into her lap. That is the Joanne who remains. The listener, the grandmother, the woman who kept her own name and her own light for 60 years. Not the night at the camper, but the whole warm life that came before it. We remember Joanne, and we leave the rest for you to weigh. Before we close, we say their names one more time, because a name is the thing a case number tries to erase, and the thing we refuse to let go. Maureen Argie, the social worker who spent her life carrying other people through their worst days. Emily Ferlazzo, the young singer whose voice deserved every stage. Natalie Perriello, the teacher who believed in every child who sat in front of her. Amy Warf, the young mother who was afraid the world wouldn't take the time to know her, and was loved by everyone who did. Nathalia DaPaixao, the mother whose community closed around her children when she could not. Joanna Colella, the caregiver who could find the bright side of almost anything. Kelly Robarge, the grandmother who was happiest near the water. And Joanne Francis, the listener who kept her own name and her own light for 60 years. 8 women, 8 full lives, not one of them defined by the man who ended it. Look across all 8, and the same thread runs straight through them. Every one of these women was a wife, and in almost every case, the danger rose at the moment she reached for her own freedom. The decision to leave, the divorce filing, the words, "I want out," that is the hard, unifying truth of this episode. In a marriage that has turned dangerous, the most perilous moment is often the leaving itself. That is not a reason to stay. It is a reason to plan. And if you take only one framework from these 8 stories, let it be this: a threat to kill, spoken out loud, a partner who stands to gain from a death, a separation already in motion, or just announced. These are not 3 separate warning signs. They are the same warning, wearing different clothes. Where you see one, look for the others, and take every one of them seriously, because the people in these stories who lived closest to the danger, the friend who heard the threat, the neighbor who heard the fight, the family who refused to believe she simply left, were often the only ones positioned to see it coming. To the families who stood in courtrooms and spoke so their daughters and sisters and mothers would never be reduced to a headline, thank you. To the investigators who followed cell phone data and oil pan fragments and a friend's uneasy conscience until the truth held, thank you. And to the courts that tested every claim in the open, the work matters. If anything in this episode struck close to home, if you or someone you know is living with a partner's threats or fear, please reach out. In the United States, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available any hour of any day at 1-800 799-7233 or text START to 88788. Wherever you are in the world, a hotline and trained advocates exist near you, and they understand, better than anyone, exactly how dangerous the leaving can be. Help with a safety plan is real, and it is closer than you think. Awareness is the one part of prevention that every single one of us can carry. So if these 8 women's stories moved you, share what you learned with someone else. Speak up when you hear a threat. Believe the person trying to leave. That is how each of us joins the fight, not with grand gestures, but by refusing to look away. Thank you for spending this time with us and for keeping their memory alive. We'll see you in the next state.